that's all about. Well, today we're going to do a little bit of a prophecy update. Again, the convergence of events. I heard an interview with David Reagan recently, and he said that one of the things that when he asked people about what they think is the biggest sign that we live in the end times, it was that all of these events seem to be converging. Can you get the front? This second, no, the next one. Next one. There you go. Thank you. They all agree that the convergence of events is probably the thing that they look at and see. All of these things happening at the same time, which is unprecedented, is what leads them to conclude that we do live in the end times and that things could begin to wrap up very quickly. I'm going to ask you to keep this in mind as we go through the prophecy update today and just look at some things that are going on in the world that I think are significant prophetically. But I'm going to ask you, in terms of the church, what's more dangerous to the church? Is it persecution or is it deception? Now, obviously, I chose the guillotine as the persecution part and the shepherd as the deception part. I'll get to this near the end, but one of the things that Scripture teaches us is that we need to be aware, on the guard for wolves that come in sheep's clothing. Now, I think that passage has been a little bit misinterpreted by a lot of people, because what you see a lot of times is a wolf with a sheepskin over it. I don't think that's an accurate picture of what that passage is trying to convey there, because it's not someone who looks like another sheep that is the problem. It's a false shepherd that is the problem. Someone who will deceive you. A wolf who comes in sheep's clothing. Who would wear something made out of sheepskin? A shepherd. Someone who takes care of sheep would use the materials that he has there available. So I think that that's what that's looking at. So as we go through this today, think about, as we look at politics, economy, that type of thing, what's more dangerous, persecution or deception? Okay? Now, this is an interesting statistic. And I don't raise this because 3.5 years is prophetic significantly, but in the 3.5 years between December of 1941 to May of 1945, or when World War II effectively ended, here's what the United States, this is an amazing statistic, this is what the United States was able to produce. 22 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, 420 destroyer escorts, 203 submarines, 100,000 fighter aircraft, 98,000 bombers, 24,000 transport aircraft, 58,000 training aircraft, 93,000 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, 105,000 mortars, 3 million machine guns, 2.5 million military trucks. We had 16.1 million men in uniform during that period of time, and we also finished the development of the atomic bomb. That's pretty amazing for a 3.5 year period by one country, which back in those days had probably half the population that we do right now. Those are some amazing, amazing statistics. The person who put that on their blog also noted that in 3.5 years, in terms of getting a functioning website, the current administration has not been able to do so. So things have changed. And again, I ask you the question, what's more destructive, deception or persecution? This is an interesting stat on the economy, spending versus revenues. Shows you where federal spending is going. Everybody talks about, oh, we're going to get this under control, doing this. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. You see where we are right now, and you see where they're projecting. You you see that revenues look to be about flat over that period of time out through 2050. And what happens to our spending? Now, is that a sustainable curve? Probably not, unless they keep printing money like crazy. I don't think it'll work. Especially in light of this is unfunded liabilities by different estimates. The official US debt's 17 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office baseline is 54 trillion. Economist James Hamilton last year said 70.1 trillion. Others have said, down here to Larry Kotlikoff, over $200 trillion deficit for things that we've promised the people that we don't yet have the revenue to pay for. So when does it all start to unwind? This is an interview with Jim Rogers. He's an economist, an economic guru a lot of people listen to. Interviewed on December 31st, sort of his 2013 wrap up.
When you talk about short term, I mean, how long are you talking? Do you think 2014 is going to be still a bull market for the Japanese markets?
Yes, yes, yes. I haven't sold anything. If I come across something, I will probably buy more. You have to also remember that this is the first time in recorded history that every central bank, major central bank in the world, is printing huge amounts of money. America, England, Europe, everybody is printing a lot of money. So we have worldwide a huge artificial sea of liquidity. I mean, look out the window. You'll probably see the ocean rising, 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 because all this liquidity is going on out there from every central bank. This is not good for the world. It's going to end very, very badly when it ends.
Okay, all right, all right, when it ends. But I guess the question is right now, it's not a rally that's driven by fundamentals. It's a rally that's driven by countries printing money. You said this could end very badly. How could it end badly, and who would it end most badly for, if we can say that?
Well, when you look out the window and you see the ocean of liquidity going down, when you see all this money drying up, which everybody has been printing, we're going to have a big collapse in stock markets around the world, and all stock markets will go down. The U.S. may go down the most, because right now the U.S. is at an all-time high, as I just said. Japan is 70% below its all-time high. China is 60 or 70% below its all-time high. So the people who will suffer the most are the ones who are up the most. It's pretty simple arithmetic.
Okay, and then speaking of the U.S. markets,
it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Okay, so well, yeah, what is your time frame for this? Because we saw that the Fed recently announced that they'd be tapering their program, buying $75 billion in bonds a month versus 85. So just a minor tapering there, keeping interest rates low for a long time. I mean, when do you think that we're going to see a change in monetary policy? And what's going to be the trigger?
Well, what will probably happen is the Fed will continue gradually to cut back. Eventually, maybe in 3 months, 6 months, I don't know, I'm no good at market timing, the markets will go down because people will get scared. But then the Federal Reserve, because it's run by bureaucrats and academics, will get scared themselves, and they'll start loosening up again, and they'll start printing more money. So this will turn into a bubble in 2014, 2015. I don't know when. I assure you, when pain starts coming again, they are scared. They're bureaucrats. They don't know how markets work, and they're going to print more, which means all markets around the world will go higher and higher. I would suspect by 2015, 2016, the rest of the world is going to say, wait a minute, this is insane. We're not going to take this garbage anymore. We don't want your paper money anymore that you keep printing. And then we'll have a serious problem. And the next time the problem comes, it's going to be much worse in 2008, because the debt is so much higher. So you should be worried, and you should be scared, and you should be prepared.
Okay, got that? Don't say I didn't tell you so. The answer is, don't know when something's going to happen, but I think something's going to happen. Interesting, this is a new magazine I subscribe to called The Commentary, and it has a Jewish orientation. John Podhoretz is the executive editor of that. There's a couple interesting articles this week about the Persian Triangle. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this closing of the scientific mind. And what they look at is all of these different trends in science about trying to turn everybody into robots and trying to make meld man and machine together. And we've talked about that here. Patrick Wood's been here, Martine Erdman, talking about transhumanism, and they're saying, wait a minute, you're getting the human subjective element out of this. And at the end of the article, it's a very interesting article, the way they reason through this and look at these trends. And it says this: the sanctity of life is what we must affirm against Kurzweilianism. That's Ray Kurzweil is one of the leading proponents of transhumanism. He is a guy who has advocated that by 2045, man will become immortal, because you will be able to upload your personality and everything into a machine, and you will be able to exist even after your body gives out, and you'll be able to download your personality and thoughts and feelings and everything into a much better made machine that you'll be able to live. And so you will become effectively immortal. So the sanctity of life is what we must affirm against these trends and the nightmare of roboticism. Judaism has always preferred the celebration and sanctification of this life and this world to eschatological promises. Now that's an interesting statement by someone who is Jewish, because what they're saying is that the here and now is what is important. Not what's going to happen out there in the future, but the here and the now. And what does that sound like? It goes on to say this: my guess is the 21st century Christian thought will move back toward its father and become increasingly Judaized, less focused on death and the afterlife, and more on life here today, although my Christian friends will dislike my saying so. But what is he saying? He's saying that the trend that he sees is exactly the trend, if you've been paying attention, you have seen happen within the evangelical church, that things have become focused now. The rise of dominionism, the rise of kingdom now, building the kingdom of God on earth, about social justice. All of the things that the modern church, the modern evangelical church is focused on, is the response to transhumanism. And it's not. We're always supposed to be looking forward to the return of the Lord. And so what's happening is that as this transhumanism has risen and made people less concerned about what's going to happen in the world, less concerned about Bible prophecy, less concerned about eschatology, what's happening is that religion, Judaism and Christianity, is being dragged right along. Oh, it's a little bit behind, and they still have the human element involved, but rest assured they're all on the same track. And eventually, in the not too distant future, I think, when a great world leader comes on the scene that's going to meld all these things into one, they'll converge. And you can see the trends that are happening. This is an interesting study, relevant to a little bit of our day. This is an amusement park in the city near Chernobyl. That city was abandoned in 1986. It's hard to believe that it's been almost 30 years since Chernobyl happened, 1986. The meltdown of the nuclear reactor in Belarus, outside the city of Kiev, and this is a city close to Chernobyl that's been completely abandoned. The pictures sort of have an apocalyptic view to them. These buildings, apartment blocks, the equipment that was used, the massive helicopters, trucks, and that type of thing used have all been abandoned. They're just sitting there. Homes are turning back to nature. They sit there completely empty. One thing that's interesting is that meltdown, by the way, had a contributing factor to another meltdown, and that was the Soviet Union. The USSR still existed in 1986, but a couple years later, it was gone, in part because of what happened at Chernobyl. I only raise this because of some of the things that are going on with this Fukushima nuclear plant meltdown in Japan. To compare it, one of the things they've gone back, there's an radioactive element called Cesium-137. That never existed in nature until we started doing open-air nuclear tests back in the 1940s and continuing up through the 1960s. I believe there were about 2,500 of these tests, but until that time, really in the environment, there was no silicium-137. But when you look at what's been released into the environment, you can see what was done by all the nuclear testing, the weapons testing that was done. Then you have Chernobyl, this part right here, but then you have Fukushima, which is releasing somewhere between 10,000 to 100,000 times the radioactive material that was released by Chernobyl and the nuclear testing. It's not good. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I've seen, the radioactive plumes. Those are not accurate pictures, but it is a problem. They're noting it in snow in the United States, increased radioactive levels, and so don't eat snow. Okay, stop eating it. In terms of this Healthcare Act, there's one provision. I have partners who spend their life now reading this stupid thing. And one of the things that nobody's really, remember what Nancy Pelosi said? We have to pass the law so you know what's in it. Okay, well, this is one thing that a lot of people didn't realize it was in it. Listen to what this says. Quality improvement, enhancing patient safety, beginning on January 1st, 2015, 1 year from now, a qualified health plan may contract with, okay, qualified health plan is what you're going to have to be in, a healthcare provider only if such provider implements such mechanisms to improve healthcare quality as the secretary may by regulation require. Do you know what that means? That means that the Secretary of Health and Human Services is now empowered to state what or require what your doctor may or may not do to take care of you. Implements such mechanisms to improve healthcare quality. They will define quality, they will define healthcare, unless this gets changed. So, Catherine Sebelius, Ohio girl. You ought to be afraid of that. An author at the Brookings Institution has an interesting article. What happened 100 years ago? 1914. World War I. And what she's looking at is she's gone back and she's examined lessons from the Great War. I think she said there were something like 32,000 books have been written about how World War I came about. And nobody's really come to a definitive conclusion. We know that it started with a rather obscure event. There was a Balkans War in 1912 and 13, and the Serbians were upset, and a certain part of this Bosnia was annexed by where the population was about 40% Serbian, was annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A guy killed the Austro-Hungarian crown prince in Sarajevo in 1914, and pretty soon the world was embroiled in a world war. It was a significant event. Some Bible prophecy people, like Arnold Fruchtenbaum, a guy I would highly recommend his book, Footsteps of the Messiah, believes that the beginning of World War I was actually a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, in that Jesus said the beginning of the birth pangs. He says that's the beginning of the birth pangs. If you look at the sweep of what happened in the 20th century with the massive wars, the massive human killings, the pogroms of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, and the millions, over 100 million people killed in that time frame by those guys, that he believes that is what Jesus was talking about when he prophesied that there would be the beginning of birth pangs. Interesting. A lot of people don't agree with him, but it's an interesting thing. This is what the author of this article says. We have entered a new and potentially perilous era. There are now 9 countries with nuclear arsenals, including Pakistan, a fractious if not failing state, and North Korea, which has proved itself as reckless as it is repressive. Have you seen the reports this week about how the latest baby Kim, whatever his name is, executed his uncle? starved a pack of dogs for 5 days and then threw them in a cell with the dogs. By the way, did that happen to anybody else in the Bible? I'm probably next week going to be starting a series. I'm going to go back and do the 7 churches of Revelation. There's a lot of stuff in there that's very applicable to our time. And one of the churches was warned about Jezebel. Jezebel was eaten by dogs. And I think we'll see some things. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Depending on whether Iran gets the bomb, numerous other states, including Japan perhaps, are likely to exercise their own nuclear options. That would make for a very dangerous world indeed, which would lead to a recreation of the kind of tinderbox that exploded in the Balkans 100 years ago, only this time with mushroom clouds. And she goes back and she looks at a lot of parallels that are happening. For example, the first time that chemical weapons were used in a war was in the First World War. And then this picture from just last year, as weapons inspectors are in Syria trying to clean up the chemical weapon mess. And there are many, many parallels. The nations are aligned very much in the same way. The countries that didn't exist in World War II, at the beginning of World War I, Syria, Iran didn't exist, Iraq, and the Middle Eastern countries that came out of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. All of these things are now the tinderbox where all of these things are happening again, and history looks like it's repeating itself. This week in Beirut is on the verge of, Lebanon on the verge of civil war, as things are bleeding over from Syria into Lebanon. And Lebanon, which went through a 10-year-long civil war not that long ago, people are very concerned that it's going to end up in the same thing, that there will be this sectarian fighting between Christians, Sunni and Shia Muslims, and what will happen in Lebanon. And all this instability is taking place right around Israel, which is an absolute contrary to what a lot of people in the evangelical church believe and in our government believe. Israel's a relative calm place, is a very calm place. But all around it, Egypt on the south, Jordan's starting to unwind to the east. A lot of concerns there because of the probably close to 1 million Syrian refugees that are now in Jordan, probably 20% of that country's population. Everything is very destabilized. We spent a lot of time and money and blood in getting Iraq into what we thought was a functioning democracy. And this week, Al-Qaeda groups are seizing some of the cities about where a lot of American men gave their lives to try to lead those cities to a place of freedom. Our country is withdrawing in this power vacuum. Everybody is now saying, as our country has withdrawn from Iraq, we're soon to withdraw from Afghanistan, we're caving into Iran, we're trying to make peace with terrorists in Israel. All of this does not look very good for us. Caroline Glick, in her article, there was a big article a week ago in the New York Times, you should read it, about Benghazi. What this article in the New York Times was an attempt to whitewash what had happened in Benghazi so Hillary Clinton can be elected president. That's all that this article was designed to do. You need to read it. Then go read that article. You can find it on the New York Times website from December 28th and 29th. Then go read Caroline Glick's article from this past Friday, January 3rd, in the Jerusalem Post, or CarolineGlick.com, and understand that the article really shows what's wrong with going on in the Middle East and the geopolitical deception that lies behind it. Because what our government is doing is, our government has defined Al-Qaeda as this little tiny group, okay? Affiliated formerly with bin Laden, now with al-Zawahiri as their leader. And those are the terrorists. Everybody else are people that we can work with. And what happened in Fallujah, or in Benghazi, shows that they are not. And our government is deceived. The people in our government, I believe we are under God's judgment. They are making wrong decisions. They make no sense, but they are doing them with vigor, and they are doubling down continually. This, for example, John Kerry's now made over 10 trips, soon to make an 11th or more trip to the Middle East to get peace, to get this framework for peace done. We have to get this done right away. And it was not lost on me that at the top of Bill Koenig's website the other day was all this about Kerry going to the Middle East to push peace, and then this map just below it with all the record low temperatures here. So again, a lot of people looking at what's going to happen. It's always the end of the year. What happened in 2013? What's going to happen in 2014? I was thinking about doing a summary of 2013, but I think I could summarize it as this. Things are not working out real well. And there were some significant things. You know, Syria, Egypt, Iran. And then I think one of the most significant things, though, was a Jewish prime minister went to the United Nations and said that the rebirth of the nation of Israel was a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. I wish that people in the church would get as bold about that as the Jewish prime minister was. In Israel, they have released all these terrorists from Israeli prisons. I think with the release this week, they'll be up to 104. That will leave 20-some that still need to be released. And it's causing a lot of problems in Israel. Terrorist attacks between Palestine and the Palestinians and Israelis and Jews are on the rise. And what would you expect? And now they're thinking that a lot of these terrorist attacks were in fact led by people that have been released from prison over the years as they've tried to make peace. This is the type of person that you're dealing with, though. This is the interview with a wife of the a member of parliament, Hamas, and she's going to talk about how she raises her children. Women in Palestine play a great role and encourage them to wage the most glorious thing a woman can do. Women play their role and are not inferior to men. When a man goes to wage jihad, his wife does not say, "Don't go," or try to stop him. She encourages and supports him. She is the one who prepares his equipment, bids him farewell, and welcomes his jihad. She instills in her children the love of jihad and martyrdom for the sake of Allah. Who would wage jihad? Who would support Palestine? Palestine is dear to us, and its price is paid with our body remains and our lifeblood. Palestine is dear to us. Is not Allah's reward precious? Allah's reward is paradise. Paradise requires from us our blood, our body remains, and our efforts. Sister, jihad is ordained for us. It is our duty to wage jihad. Because either we wage jihad, we want to die as martyrs, indeed we do. I am constantly praying. Allah, make the end of our days be in martyrdom. I pray for this even for my husband and my children. None of us want to die in our beds. We pray that Allah will grant us paradise. So see, to the Muslim, the only way to guarantee that you will get paradise is to die as a martyr in jihad. A lot of things going on, again, with Israel and the two-state illusion. People are saying, this will never happen. You'll never get a two-state solution. Caroline Glick has a book coming out in a couple of months. I wish she'd release it now so somebody in our government might read it. Two-state solution is an illusion. I do believe that there will be a two-state solution. I think it's prophesied in the Bible. I've talked about that. We'll go into that some other time. Israel Science Minister says we're going to need to evacuate 15 to 25% of Judea and Samaria to make peace. The Bible's very clear that places are important. And God does things over and over again at the same place. There are many examples of that. For example, Elijah began his ministry near the Jordan. When he was caught up into heaven, it was there along the banks of the Jordan. And Elisha caught his mantle, picked up his mantle, and went on to his ministry. And then later, one came, as the scripture says, in the spirit of Elijah. And where was his ministry? It was in the same place that Elijah had ministered, John the Baptist. We see this with, I don't have time to go into it. Go and look up Shechem. Do a study. First, find out what Shechem means. Then go do a study on Shechem and its references in the Bible and find out what happened there. Because what you'll find is that when Abraham came into the land, and then when the Jews came back from Egypt and came into the land, the greatest places of resistance to them were twofold. A place along the coast called Philistia, which we now know as Gaza, and the mountains of Israel, and that's central, the area of what we now know as Judea and Samaria. What is the area of greatest resistance to the Jewish state today? Gaza and Judea and Samaria. So what you see in the Bible is you see these patterns repeating over, and what you'll find is that, yeah, there's an application, but as we get closer to the end, it's really important to pay attention to these things. So go read Ezekiel 35 through 37 about the prophecies about the mountains of Israel and what happens there, and know that that's the area of Judea and Samaria. And understand that history is repeating itself. Erekat, who's one of the lead negotiators, he was, the Palestinians, has sent Obama a letter, or given Obama a letter from a boss, saying that these are the 5 main things that the Palestinians are looking at as they do their negotiations with Israel. 1, not able to accept Israel as a Jewish state. 2, not able to accept the Palestinian state with 1967 borders without all of Jerusalem. 3, not able to accept any Israeli, that is a Jew, any Jew on Palestinian land, sea, air, and border crossings following the completion of the gradual withdrawal. Jew-free. Right of return for Palestinian refugees and the continued release of prisoners that are held. Now, how do you make peace with that? And yet our government has sent, our Secretary of State has made at least 11 trips there now in the last couple of months trying to achieve peace, with this being the negotiating posture of the other side. What Erekat wants, Erekat's very upset about this development in Israel, that they want to annex the land across the Jordan River to Israel and keep it as part of the Jewish state of Israel if there is a 2-state peace solution. And it's necessary. You can't have that land in the control of the Palestinians. It would be a recipe for disaster, especially if the Jordanian government falls, and right now it's not looking like it's going to have anything happen to it other than what's happened to all the other surrounding countries in Lebanon and Iraq and Syria. That's going to happen there. What Erekat wants to do is he wants to go to the International Criminal Court, an arm of the UN in the Netherlands, and put in place, file a lawsuit against Israel to force them to accept peace terms, to get Israel to recognize them as peace and that type of thing. Those positions, by the way, that I showed you that Erekat had put, and that was in the letter that a boss sent to President Obama this past year, came out of these documents, which you can find online if you just look for the Palestine Papers. you will see that this has been the position, the negotiating posture of the Palestinians and always will be. They have no desire for peace. Israel is the only party that seems to want to have peace. And yet you have people in our churches and different political persuasions in our country talking about boycotting Israel. I think must be a college graduate.
Yeah.
To spell boycott like that. You see things in the press. For example, this is a picture from an editorial in the Sunday Times in London last January, about a year ago, showing Benjamin Netanyahu building a wall using the blood of Palestinians, the blood and body parts of Palestinians as mortar. This is the kind of people that they're trying to deal with. In London right now, there's a church, I think it's St. James Church, it's an Anglican church, and they've constructed this wall. It's to represent the wall that they say, which they wrongly say encircles Bethlehem. There's a wall around part of Bethlehem, but it's not all the way around Bethlehem. But they talk about how our Bethlehem brothers and sisters are oppressed and that type of thing. Melanie Phillips, you got to read her article about this. She says that this thing is a joke, and she says this. This is from their website, Bethlehem Unwrapped. This is what they were doing for their Christmas celebration this year. Melanie Phillips says this: the wall is of course a stunt, but the damage it has done to the Church of England is immense, because what it does is put the church on the side of lies and hatred against truth and justice. It has put the Church of England on the side of evil. The only purpose of Israelis' security barrier is to save life and prevent mass murder. The only purpose of the St. James Church Bethlehem Unwrapped stunt is to stir up hatred. And this is what is happening in the evangelical church. One of the leading proponents of what Paul Wilkinson has termed Christian Palestinianism is Gary Burge. He's a professor of New Testament at Wheaton. He wrote a book about 10 years ago called Whose Land, Whose Promise? Now, CAMERA, which is a Mideast media research arm that looks for misrepresentations and false facts about Israel in the media, looked through Gary Burge's book in 2003. They had email correspondence that said, Dr. Burge, you've misrepresented facts. You've misrepresented articles written by Daniel Pipes and others. You've made them say the exact opposite of what they've said. Gary Burge responded this way. Now, the reason is he's come out with a new, updated version of that book, Whose Land, Whose Promise? His position is that the modern state of Israel is an accident of history and has nothing to do with the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. He's a replacement theologian. He speaks regularly at the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference. He speaks at other evangelical conferences along with people like Lynn Hybels, the wife of Bill Hybels, pastor of Willow Creek, who are fully on board with this. And so his response to the accusation that there's lies in the book was this: we've had the same conversation for many years, because what they found is the new book has new misrepresentations, new bad facts. My challenge to you is to examine the substance of the book and its main thesis. The military occupation of over 3.8 million people is both immoral and unsustainable by both political and theological measures. Read the last chapter of the book. There are 4 possible solutions to this problem, and many Israelis and non-Israelis alike, think that Israel will ultimately default to a form of apartheid if it has not done so already. Did you just not read the letter that Abbas sent to Obama that said they wanted a Jew-free Palestinian country? Has Israel ever made such a thing? Folks, deception will be rampant in the end times, and Gary Burge is deceived. Does that mean he's always wrong? No. But it means that he is blinded on this. He is blind to the facts. And then he says this: In a season that is remembering Nelson Mandela, it is remarkable that you're discussing Israeli licenses instead of the moral problem hidden in Israel-Palestine. This thesis is a challenge by minor items and footnotes that you pick out, some of which correct, some of which are not. Translation: look, don't bother me with the facts. My opinion is what's important. In the academy, Dexter, we examine the chief thesis of an argument. We don't work around the edges like this. To suggest that there are factual errors in a minor footnote is akin to saying that a speaker's thesis is false because he pronounced a word wrong. This is what's wrong with academia today. This, what Gary Burge says, passes for truth in academia. In Christian evangelical institutions, it passes. He's wrong about his fundamentals, but he says, well, look, my thesis is okay. And so this is typical that if your opinion becomes part of you. And so if I disagree with you, I hate you. And this is what part of the tolerance and all this junk that they've taught us for the last 50 years or more is coming to true. Cameron responded like this to Gary Burge. In his book, he reports his facts with a breathless and outraged tone to advance the story he tells. These facts matter for what they are, for they are what Christians are not being told about Israel and the Palestinians. But when confronted with evidence that his facts aren't true, Burge argues that the mistakes aren't all that important. If that is the case, then why did he include these assertions in the first place? If the licenses aren't important, why bring them up? They're talking about driver's licenses. And Burge's assertion that Palestinians and Jews have to go on different days in Israel to get their driver's licenses, which I believe is absolutely false. That would be Arabs that live non-Jewish Arabs that live within the state of Israel. If the licenses aren't important, then why bring them up? If the law of return isn't important, then why bring it up? The whole point of Burge's book is that an Israeli withdrawal from territory claimed by the Palestinians, a two-state solution, will bring about peace. What's his evidence? And the answer is he has very little evidence. Now we also have this concern that Hezbollah has all these missiles, upgraded missiles. You know, you've heard about the explosions in Syrian ports where things are blown up. Now they're bringing them in piecemeal and smuggling them into Lebanon, giving them to Hezbollah. And now Hezbollah is upgrading its missile capabilities and will have guided missile capability to attack specific targets within Israel instead of just lobbing a rocket in there in hopes that it does the most damage. Listen, 2 Thessalonians 2 says that in the end times there will be a diluting influence so that they will believe what is false. That won't not exist before it comes to full fruition. It will be in place and operative long before it blooms in its final glory, if you will. There will be delusion, deception operating. It will be in the church, it will be in our government, it will be in our political institutions, it will be in our schools. And the people of God are constantly warned in Scripture that we are to be on the guard for deception and false teaching. That's what we are supposed to look out for. Focus on the truth, but also be aware of false teaching, so you don't get destroyed by it, because false teaching will destroy you. Persecution, remember I started early talking about persecution? Persecution, the church usually flourishes under persecution. Now, that's hard for us to understand because we've kind of lived a pretty good life here in America. But if persecution comes, I believe it will be consistent with what's happened historically. It will be good for the remnant faithful church of true believers in Jesus Christ. God will protect us. God will let happen to us what He will. Our obligation is to stay faithful to the truth of the Word of God. Deception destroys us. Now finally, I'll close with this. Persian Triangle. We'll get into the 7 churches and some other things next week. There's also the article in Commentary Magazine called the Persian Triangle. We know from Scripture that Prime Minister Netanyahu testified or referred to in his speech at the UN this past fall, that scripture talks about the Persians and the Persian king and the relationship between Persia and the Jewish people. In the end times, that relationship is going to be adversarial. Look at what happened historically, and you will understand what's going to happen in the future. But within this Persian triangle, this area down here, you see Iran and this area, and this is where about close to 60% of the world's known oil reserves lie. Another big chunk lie up there, just in the Caspian Sea, just to the north of Iran. Heavily controlled Muslim countries. So this Persian triangle is extremely important to the geopolitics and economics of the world. And the thing that you need to understand about this is that the dark green area is Shia Islam. The Iranian version of Islam is effectively what controls this region. That has enormous geopolitical and economic consequences. This is what the article in Commentary Magazine says. The late Christopher Hitchens, an intellectual of the left, also untypically a critic of the left, spoke of the liberal softness and totalitarianism. When it comes to Iranian totalitarianism, that softness takes the form of delusion. The Islamic Republic is seen as a normal nation, seeking stability in its region and interested in nuclear technology only for peaceful purposes, or at most because of security concerns. This is what our government, a lot of it, believe. Leslie Yelv, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, recently wrote that while he does not like the clerical dictators in Tehran one bit, I can understand how they might feel threatened by Israel and the West. Yelv's dislike is well earned, for the clerical dictators ordered different things. The attack in Beirut in 1983 that killed American Marines, Khobar Towers 1996, Argentinian attacks in the 1990s, and recently flubbed an attempt to assassinate the Saudi ambassador by blowing up a Georgetown restaurant in which he was to be dining. In other words, the guy who says, I don't really like the clerics, but I understand why they're upset. He was supposed to be in the restaurant that they were going to blow up the night to kill that the Iranians were going to blow up to kill the Saudi ambassador. And still he says that. He's deceived. Yet it is they, in Gelb's analysis, who might feel threatened by Israel and the West, and in his view, understandably so. Many of Gelb's cohorts in the media, think tanks, and the Department of State, three institutions in which he has worked at high levels, choose not to believe that Iran's rulers, hardliners, and moderates alike subscribe to a coherent and seriously bellicose ideology, a Shia version of the radical Sunni belief system that drives al-Qaeda and its many affiliates. Both systems on the imperative of Islamic supremacy and eventually global domination, the conviction that Muslims have quite literally a God-given right to rule over unbelievers. In response to what our government is doing to force Israel to release terrorists, you need to go to the Times of Israel and read this lady's article called, her name is Sherry Mandel, and she says, I'm glad that my son's murderers, her son was murdered by terrorists, some of whom are being released from prison. She says, I'm glad, well, no, they haven't been convicted. I'm glad that they were never convicted, that I had to live to see these people get out of prison. This is being forced by Barack Obama and his administration. This is deception. These are people who are operating under a delusion, a total delusion. And this week, just the other day, Lynn Stewart was released from prison here in the United States. Now, do you know who Lynn Stewart is? Lynn Stewart is a radical left-wing attorney. She was convicted of aiding the blind sheik, who was her client, pirating messages out of prison to his followers so they could engage in attacks elsewhere in the world where at least 5 dozen people were killed and slaughtered in bombing attacks. She was convicted, disbarred, put in prison. She got breast cancer. She was given, at the behest of the Barack Obama administration this week, compassionate release. Here's a story from Fox News that explains what happened.
That is a video from the 1993 World Trade Center bombing that left 6 people dead, more than 1,000 injured, and a nation shaken. Tonight, concerns those painful memories are being outweighed by progressive politics, basically. The convicted terrorist, known as the Blind Sheikh, accused of inspiring that attack, was actually put behind bars for plotting to bomb multiple New York City landmarks. After he was sentenced to life in prison, he was banned from any communication with the outside world because this is what terrorists do. But attorney Lynn Stewart, who represented him, violated the rules, and she was convicted in 2005 of helping smuggle messages from the convicted Blind Sheikh to his terrorist groups abroad. Supposed to be behind bars until 2018, she was. And now she is a free woman, thanks to a helping hand from the administration. Now in a Kelly File exclusive, Deborah Burlingame. She's the director and co-founder of 9/11 Families for a Safe and Strong America. She is the sister of the late Captain Charles Burlingame, who piloted the plane that the terrorists crashed into the Pentagon on September 11th. This is unbelievable.
She looked pretty hale and hearty when she came out at LaGuardia yesterday, giving interviews to the press again. She is a remorseless woman. She calls the Blind Sheikh, whose followers have maimed, mutilated, killed dozens and dozens of people in an effort to get him released. She calls him the hero of the Mujahideen. I watched the video of her being interviewed at LaGuardia, I think is where she came in, talked about my beloved New York. It's so great to be here. Her beloved New York, the guy she calls the hero of the Mujahideen, is responsible for the deaths, directly responsible as that's his cell that hit the World Trade Center. 6 people.
Why would they do that?
And a 7.5-month-old unborn baby was blown to pieces in the garage of that place.
Why would the administration, because they have to do this through the Bureau of Prisons, controlled by the DOJ, why would they help her?
Well, you have to remember that the Attorney General has a big say in this. The Attorney General is the one who signs off every year on the security administrative directives, what they call the SAMs, special administrative procedures, measures that keep him away from the press. Whenever Lynn Stewart went in to see him, she had to sign a paper saying that she would agree never to discuss or relay any messages.
I mean,
yeah. She had to.
That's why she got convicted.
Well, and she also, her sentence got, jacked up to 10 years after the appellate level said that she perjured herself on the stand.
The left-leaning Second Circuit.
But in answer to your question, Eric Holder helped in the clemency of the FALN terrorists. He was the go-to guy in the Reno Justice Department who made that happen. Eric Holder is the guy who hired a lot of the Gitmo lawyers who did this same kind of thing down at Guantanamo. That is, breaking the rules and getting messages out to Mujahideen all around the world and jihadis.
When you think of her saying she didn't want to die in a strange, loveless place, and you think about how these innocent victims died at the hands of these terrorists, it's really a juxtaposition.
Well, I think about the 8 children who died on 9/11, 5 of them on my brother's plane. The mastermind behind that was inspired by her client.
Yeah, by this guy who she helped. Deb, good to see you.
Exactly right.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Thanks for coming on.
Well, I don't have time to go into it, but Daniel 11:37 says that someday a world leader will come. He'll show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. Now, I'm not saying that the person who's behind the release of Lynn Stewart is this person, but I'm saying is, you need to be prepared that there will be many people like this in the world. There will be many candidates. One will eventually rise to become the Antichrist. But to release this murderous lawyer from prison I cannot think of something more fulfilling of the prophecy of Daniel, that he will show no regard for the desire of women. You saw what that woman, that Hamas, the Palestinian member of parliament's wife, said, what she would do to her children. This is indicative that we live in the end times. So, Jesus said, when you see all this happening, look up, the redemption draws nigh.